Coming up this morning on the Elected podcast, there's T-minus 80 days until you go to the polls to decide who will be representing you in the legislative branch of government in 2018. We talk with a very important person about a very important subject that you may face when going to the polls. All that and much more coming up on episode 3, 80 days, for the week of August 18th, 2018. This is the Elected podcast. Good morning, everyone. You are listening to the Elected Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Radel. Now, first of all, we have a very important interview this week, sort of doing stuff a little bit differently with the show. It's not going to be as news-centered this week, but it's going to be more issue-focused. But first, before we begin with that, I'd like to give you our top stories. The first story that I'd like to address is President Trump came to Utica this week. And it was fantastic. I was able to get into the event. We should have a video coming out very soon about that. Exclusive content. We were the only one in the local media allowed in. They let in Fox News and CNN. We were the only ones in the local media allowed into the event. So it was fantastic. We're going to have a very important video about that coming up very soon. And then also President Trump went to Fort Drum, New York to sign a bill for John Mccain and did not once mention the senator's name. Now, the president has had many feuds with the senator due to his health care bill not passing. And I do want to tease a little for next week as well, or for the next time you're going to hear on the podcast. On August 28th, 2018, we're going to have the sitting congresswoman on the show. Congresswoman Claudia Tenney will come on the podcast to talk about Trump's visit to Utica and to talk about health care, as well as a wide range of issues. That's going to be a longer podcast. And I'm probably going to have to edit down the interview, but we are going to leave the full interview on our Patreon, which is another thing I wanted to announce. We have a Patreon now. It's going to be tiered levels. You can support it. It's not obligated. There's all sorts of exclusive stuff, including seeing videos before they are released. You could get a producer credit on the show and be able to weigh in on topics for our episodes. And you can see videos that have never been seen by anyone before, just made exclusively for Patreon patrons. If you're able to give a donation, please go to patreon.com/elected. It really helps us with all that we do here. It's not going to me. It's going right back to the channel. I don't do this for the money. I do it because I want to provide great news content. But, you know, if I want to provide great news content, I need some funding. So we have very important projects in the works, including our live special on November 6th, 2018 at 9 p.m. We're going to be covering all the latest news and polls with a lot of special guests on that show. So it should be spectacular. But if you're able to support us on Patreon, I'll leave a link in the description below, patreon.com/elected. If you can't, that's fine. Thank you for all you do every week anyway. Subscribing, liking, commenting, sharing, all that is fantastic. We really do appreciate it. Now let me get on to our special guest interview. Joining me now on the podcast is my cousin, and she's majoring this year in UB and environmental studies, Mady Radel. Mady, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Of course, Luke. I'm so excited to do it.
So why don't you just explain for everybody what you're studying this year and what you're going to be doing?
So basically, my major focuses on the problems facing the Earth right now, like climate change, ocean depletion, all those things like pollution in the air, in the water, in our environments, and basically how to combat those issues with sustainability and other approaches. So it focuses on economics and politics and chemistry and biology and sociology. It definitely is an interdisciplinary program.
That's awesome. And so you have a very strong connection to the political side of this because, as you know, our current president just a few months ago dropped out of the Paris Climate Accord. Talk about why that might not have been a good choice for the United States to withdraw from such an accord.
It's always kind of alarming to me that in today's world, when climate issues are so apparent, I mean, we see in the past few years that weather has gotten increasingly intense, just by the sheer number and volume of hurricanes and other tropical storms. I find it hard to believe that people wouldn't believe in something like climate change and understand that, our climate is evolving and that humans play some role in it. So the fact that, the people who are supposed to be representing our nation on a global scale are dropping out of important talks, it's almost like a peace talk, but it's for the environment. And the fact that our administration pulled us out of something that could potentially help save our planet and make it a better place and a livable place for future generations is frustrating. It's kind of okay, though, because these kind of talks tend to be unsuccessful just because the countries that are involved, like even if the U.S. did go, are unwilling to put forth regulations
Right.
and to actually make change. So, I mean, if we go or if we don't go, it's more of a standpoint on how we feel about it more than if we're going to make the change. And if a big country like the U.S. is, denying things like climate change, that's the real problem as opposed to attending at all.
Right, and what I will say is too is when the president goes over to NATO and imposes tariffs on them and kind of scolds them for not paying their due. It's a similar thing with these accords. It's that maybe even if you show up, you're not doing your part. You're still sending up harmful chemicals into the air, and
Yep.
at some point we need to have a dynamic leader, and that's what Emmanuel Macron over in France is trying to be. But
Right.
you need allies, and at the end of the day, I feel like the United States should be a strong leader for the world on this issue. It's a very important issue,
Yeah,
and
definitely.
we should jump in the race. I mean, we need to have a strong dynamic leader, and that's just not what we have here.
I agree. I'm definitely, though, optimistic just because other bigger countries have started to take a stand. You'd be surprised the amount of work that, say, India is doing compared to the United States.
Right.
So the fact that these big countries that have billions of people are starting to take a stand, it gives me hope that, perhaps in a few years, depending on different political climates, different political leaders, the U.S. might be able to follow in their footsteps.
Right, and the president was saying that they were following these regulations from the Paris Climate Accord, but that it was strangling jobs for the middle class. Now, as you know, a lot of the jobs for the middle class are in coal plants and steel plants, which, while they're jobs that are good for these people, they may not be the best for the environment, and these regulations were causing a lot of Americans to lose their jobs. Do you think prioritizing their jobs over the environment was the right choice to make?
I always tell everyone that I talk to about the environment and about environmental science in general that the reason why it's so hard is because it's a multifaceted issue, and there's a lot of people's lives involved in it.
Right.
And at the end of the day, I think it is important for middle class people to maintain their jobs. But I think that in environmental cleanup activities and in, transfers to clean energy, there can be a creation of more jobs. But like I said, I mean, at the end of the day, these people have jobs and they have lives and they have families and they need to carry it up. And so I think that that's why it's important from the government as sort of, from the top down to make it easier for people to enter jobs that are, say, greener. I know, like, in New York State, they built Solar City in Buffalo, and they have quotas. Like, they have to create, 1,000 jobs by the end of this year, and in, like, 5 years, they have to create 5,000 jobs. And so by making sure that clean energy businesses are having those sort of quotas to get people is a big important thing. But at the same time, I think people maybe don't have the education for it. I think that clean energy jobs might require a higher level of education, whereas
Right.
if you're, mining coal or transporting coal, you might have not been required that in the past.
Well, I
So
think it's a matter of retraining retraining
Yeah.
those middle class workers to do, for clean energy, and or just to have another job. Maybe
Yeah.
it's not. Maybe energy is something that they were able to do in the past, but I feel like if we're continuing to use these coal plants and whatnot, I feel like we're sticking ourselves back in the 20th century.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I was surprised because in America our air is pretty clean in terms of when we look at the air or when we inhale the air, but obviously there's a lot going on in here. But when I went to a more congested place, I went to London in the winter. Every single night when you would blow your nose, it would just be black and dust. Like, the air there is so polluted.
Yikes.
And I always say that because our air is clean and maybe our water looks clean or whatever, it makes it so that people here are kind of apathetic to the cause of environmental science and of climate change and all that, because we don't nearly face the effects as much as other people. But I still think that it's a big issue and we're a big contributor to it. So
yeah, and I think we had a conversation about this before when I first had the idea of having you on the show. Where I said, for a while there, I didn't totally agree with the fact that this was all man-made, and sort of saw the fact that, we were still in an ice age, and we were as we come out of the ice age, the temperatures would rise. But you had said some stuff that was very contrary to that, and saying that no, this is our fault here, or at least we're a big contributor to it. Can you talk about that for a moment?
yeah, sure. So basically, if you go back to about 1950, a lot changed in our atmosphere in terms of the concentration of carbon dioxide. And actually, I learned this past year that they actually had to do carbon dating differently. I don't know if you've taken chemistry, but
Right,
you
yeah.
can do radioactive dating to look at how old something is based on their half-lives. Well, that has all been changed because of the sheer volume of atmospheric carbon. And there's a direct link to industry in that. Another thing is, for example, there are a lot of man-made compounds that we release into the air. Some of them are called CFCs, which stand for chlorofluorocarbons. And those are human-made chemicals. And what those do is those are actually the chemicals that were destroying the ozone for a while, causing more intense UV rays to come in, which obviously was altering climate change, increasing the heat, increasing sunlight, etc. And those chemicals were made directly by human beings. So we can't think that this is a natural occurrence when these are chemicals made and released by human beings. They were actually in hairspray and other aerosols, and they would go up into the air, they would mess with the ozone and actually break it down and make some holes, causing increased UV rays. So I think that, part of it is just the natural cycles of life. Carbon dioxide goes into the air at certain times, and, sunlight can fluctuate, but at the end of the day, it is more so human beings' doings and perhaps just our ignorance to what we were doing that's causing these issues, as opposed to, just natural occurrences.
Right, and so that's a great closing note. What would be your advice to President or to the current administration? Do you think they should rejoin the Paris Climate Accord?
I think that it is important for a nation as big as us and as powerful as us to take a stand and at least show that we are interested and dedicated to making a difference. So I think that even if nothing comes from going to the Accords, just being there and showing our support is one of the most important things we can do to enact true change in the future.
Right. And so one last question here. Why do you think voters should care about this when going to the polls in 2018?
It affects us all, and every single state, every single district, we all face different issues because of the climate and just because of environmental science in general. It might have to do with the farming. It might have to do with your water. Depending if you live in the Midwest, your water might be really polluted. And I think that it's extremely important where your representatives stand on this, because they're going to be the ones who are your voice in our government. So if your representative is going to hold us back from making a change in terms of climate change or other environmental issues and regulations, maybe don't vote for them. So pick people that are going to be forward thinkers and in support of enacting change on our climate and on our environment.
Thank you so much for coming on the show, Mady. It was really a pleasure.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
That'll do it this week for the Elected Podcast. Thank you for listening, and be sure to tune in next week when we have on the sitting Congresswoman Claudia Tenney to talk about President Trump's visit to New York. Thanks again for listening. Be sure to support us on our Patreon page, patreon.com/elected. And as always, be sure to subscribe, like, comment, and share. Thanks for listening to the Elected Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Radel.